the chat box. I don't know if you
Oh,
guys.
yeah. Did your response show up though? Does it say from Maryland to everyone?
I don't see it.
There's no volume control.
Sometimes, is there a little arrow?
I don't see any arrow.
Let's see here. Let me get, okay.
I'm Marilyn, and I'm from Riverside, California.
Okay. Thank you. That's another way to do it too. Thank you. All right, it is 7:01, so I would like us to get started, and I'm going to continue to add people as they come into the waiting room here. My name is Nancy Cowan. I am a librarian at the Irondequoit Public Library. Since last March, our Irondequoit Genealogy Group has been meeting via Zoom, but we normally meet monthly within the library building. And as I had mentioned, maybe some of you didn't hear, we do have people from all over participating tonight. So I would love it if you could put in the chat where you are watching us from. And that would be wonderful to see where everybody's coming in from. And tonight we are going to be hearing Ryan Hughes. He's going to talk to us about digitizing our memories. And he works for the Rochester Regional Library Council, and they, well, I'm actually going to let him tell a little bit about himself. But we are going to take questions as we go, and I will present the questions to Ryan so he can just kind of concentrate on his presentation there. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And he does have a little bit of time at the end too. If you think of something near the end of the presentation, we can take questions at that time as well. So with that, I will give it over to Ryan and take it away, Ryan. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. First, I want to make sure, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And you can see my slide, which says digitizing your memories.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So today's webinar is titled Digitizing Your Memories, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening. It's, you know, it feels late. I guess if you're in California, it's not so late. So I'm just really happy to be here. I do want to send a thank you to Nancy and Amy from Irondequoit Public Library for having me here tonight. The goal of this presentation is to introduce you to some digitization concepts that you can apply to your genealogy work. We're going to cover a number of topics such as choosing a digital format, describing your collection, storage options, and long-term access to your digital objects. So let's get started. Okay. So just a little bit of an introduction and a background. The Rochester Regional Library Council is a multi-type library network serving libraries, museums, and historical societies in a 5-county Rochester region. That includes Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Wayne, and Wyoming counties. And the Rochester Regional Library Council is a member of the Empire State Library Network, which is comprised of 9 regional library councils in the state of New York. As Digital Initiatives Librarian, I'm responsible for coordinating member contributions to New York Heritage Digital Collections, Empire ADC, and New York State Historic Newspapers. And I'll talk a bit more about those resources later. In terms of a personal introduction, I've been a librarian since, I've worked in libraries since 1996. I spent about 16 years working as a public librarian at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. And you know, in that time, I held a number of different positions, and I've had a lot of opportunities to work with folks doing genealogy work like yourselves. And so these days, I don't get a lot of opportunities to work with the public, so it's nice to be here tonight with all of you. Nancy and Amy had contacted me about presenting to this genealogy group a little over a year ago now, I think. And so I'm just really thrilled to be able to have this opportunity. This presentation comes out of one that I did back in May for RRLC members, and the goal was to introduce them to basic digitization concepts and identify some of the early decisions that can be made to ensure that their projects run smoothly. In the course of the last year, I've also been talking to family members who are taking this time to sort of sort through boxes of photographs and other personal memories. And what I noticed is that a lot of questions that they had about scanning family photos and documents were very similar to those of our members. And really the difference is just scale. If you just think about like shoe boxes versus file cabinets. For tonight's presentation, I've taken that information that I would normally share with our members, and I'm hopefully presenting it in a way that will help you tackle the work you're doing with your own family memories. And so before I proceed, I'd just like to hear if there's anyone here that does any sort of digitization work, whether as a staff person or a volunteer with a cultural heritage organization, such as a historical society, a library, or a museum. If that's the case, could you just please make a quick comment in the chat?
Mary Jean works with the DAR.
I know Larry does quite a bit. So, okay, well, the reason why I did ask that is because I will touch on some things that may seem a little bit more relevant to someone who works in a cultural heritage or works for or works with a cultural heritage organization. But I think there'll be some things that you can take away from that as well. Okay, great. So we're getting some comments in here. Excellent. Okay, let me move on. So the first thing I want to just talk about is make a distinction between digitization and digital preservation. These two terms are often mistakenly used interchangeably, or it's assumed that a digitized object is now permanent. So let's start with a definition of digitization. Digitization is the process of taking a physical or analog object and creating a digital copy of that object. And that definition comes from Carmen Cohen, who wrote a wonderful book called Digital Curation Projects Made Easy, a step-by-step guide for libraries, archives, and museums. So really what digitization is about is increasing access to an object or a collection. Digital preservation is a separate stage in a digital project's life cycle, and it's meant to ensure that the digital object lasts as long as the analog version or longer. Simply put, digital preservation is the process of taking care of the digital objects to ensure long-term access. And so I just want to stress, digitization does not equal digital preservation. There are a number of ways that we can lose access to digital objects. Digital objects can succumb to bit rot, which is the gradual deterioration of the data. Second, file format obsolescence. In this case, the file format becomes unreadable. Something that I'm sure we've all experienced in our lifetimes is hardware and application obsolescence. The hardware needed to access the files is no longer available, or at the very least, it's hard to find. And so an example of that would be if you came across, if you had in your possession or you found a stack of cassettes that maybe contained interviews with various family members. Now you have to wonder, do I have a cassette player that I can listen to these on? I'm sure that some of you do have one. I actually have two in my home. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but what we'll find is that there are a number of things that we have in an analog form that we no longer have the hardware to either play them on or to display them. So a really detailed look of digital preservation is beyond the scope of today's presentation. And it really should be noted that even large institutions, large and small, struggle with digital preservation. Many organizations that we work with at RRLC do not have the resources to meet the requirements of long-term digital preservation. So for individuals looking for a way to ensure that their digital files are protected, the challenge can be even greater. So that said, there are some things that we can do to ensure long-term access to our digital files. The first of those is the 3-2-1 rule. And this is a really handy sort of rule or guideline that you can apply to your work. And what it states is that you keep
back.
3 copies of your files saved on 2 different media formats and at least 1 copy backed up off-site. So this can be as simple as storing 1 copy on a local hard drive, a 2nd copy stored on a separate storage device, and a 3rd copy stored off-site. So off-site can mean a couple different things. It could be another physical location. It could be with a family member or a friend. It could be in a cloud service like Google Drive or Dropbox. But having these sort of 3 versions of your files should give you a sense of security that you'll be able to access the data in the event that one of the files become corrupted or unretrievable. And I do want to just stress that anything you do is better than nothing. So even if your solution is keeping a backup drive in a small fire safe, it's better than having no plan at all. The only thing I would recommend is that if you are going to be storing these files in a different location, just make sure someone else knows where that information is stored and how they can access it. So let's talk about some of the common reasons for digitization. So as we discussed, the primary goal of digitization is increasing access to analog objects. Let's face it, digital objects are really easy to share. We can post them online, we can share them via email. It's just a really great way for us to sort of distribute things that we have and we want to share with others. Second, digitization is a way to preserve physical objects. You may have objects in your possession that are fragile, things that you don't want to handle a lot. Digitization allows you to access those objects without placing too much wear and tear on the original. And third, digitization protects against loss. This is particularly true if you work in a cultural heritage organization, is that your collections have value, and digitization allows us to make unique objects more widely available without losing them to theft or damage. And really, this is true of our personal memories as well. There are a lot of things that can happen to the things that we have in our home, we have in our possession. Having a backup, a digital backup of those, really just sort of adds life to them and sort of makes sure that we do have sort of some long-term access in the event that something terrible happens. So next we're going to, I guess I could just pause here because it's a good stop. Is there any questions that anybody has so far?
Yes, can you repeat that 3-2-1 rule again?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just go back a couple slides. So the 3-2-1 rule, we treat it as a guideline, and it states that 3 copies saved on 2 different media formats. So think like 2 different, like, a portable hard drive and another portable hard drive, or a flash drive, or in your desktop computer. But of the 3 formats, you have 2 saved on 2 different media formats, and then a 3rd copy backed up off-site. And as I said, that could be off-site, could be a different physical location. It could also be on a cloud service like Google Drive or Dropbox. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Let me get back to where we're at. Okay, so assessing your collections. Let's look at some important factors that you want to consider early on. Again, some of this might be more relevant for those working with a cultural heritage organization, but you can really apply these to your own items. So the first off, you need to consider who is your audience. So knowing who will be using these digital objects will guide your decisions about what you choose to digitize and the quality of the digital copy. So are you digitizing for personal use? Or are you sharing these items with family, friends, or maybe a wider community? Sort of knowing who you're digitizing for will really help kind of inform the next step, is selecting your materials. What are your high priority items? high priority items that could mean a couple different things. It could be, they may be a high priority item because they're conditioned, they're fragile items. They may be high priority because of their uniqueness of that object. And they might be high priority because of the demand. So you may have something in your possession that other people in your family or your sort of network would really like to take a look at. That might be something worth digitizing first. If you have a collection of letters that are kind of yellowing and getting brittle, those would be ideal for digitization because you don't want to, do a lot of handling there. If you're part of a cultural heritage organization, you need to take into account your budget. There are limitations and restrictions sometimes on the use of funds, so just be aware of those. Also, when you're considering a project and you're thinking about your budget, you also need to take into consideration long-term costs and short-term costs. So long-term costs could be, replacing hardware or any fees associated with hosting your collection, but there could be some short-term costs as well, like any immediate hardware purchases that you might need, or any costs associated with the scanning. And then lastly, you need to consider your time frame. And I really think this is true, but whether it's an individual or an organization, is how much time do you have to dedicate to this project? I've always found that digitization projects take longer than you initially expect. And if you're doing some type of community project or a larger project, there may be a deadline. So you could be working on a centennial celebration for your community, or you could be working on putting together some materials for a family reunion. Just be aware of your deadlines or the timeframes you have and sort of plan accordingly. Okay, so as we move into this presentation, I'd like to discuss 3 important components of a digitization project. And this is where we're really getting into talking about doing the actual digitization. We're going to talk about scanning, particularly about resolution and choosing a file type. We're going to go into a little bit about ownership and permission, and then we're going to talk about working with metadata. So we'll do this by looking at some specific examples. So before we start scanning, there are a few factors to consider. We talked a little bit about selecting materials, but we need to be aware of, do any of the items that I have require special handling? I've talked a little bit about those papers, a letter that may be brittle, or even, a photograph, any sort of older items that you need to, sort of take special care of. The condition of that object, as I said, might make it a high priority. Second, what scanning equipment do you have access to? Many consumer flatbed scanners can only accommodate standard size objects, typically no greater than 11 by 17. If you're scanning larger objects, such as a map, or even a bound object, such as a diary, you might need a more specialized scanner. Smaller, loose page objects, such as photographs or letters, can easily be scanned on a home scanner. And finally, what are the requirements of the digital image? And this can be answered by deciding how you intend to use the digital objects. Will you be sharing them online? Will you be reproducing it at a later date to, making prints from your digital copies? This really gets into the image resolution that you choose, and also the file type that you choose to save your images as. And so we're going to look at those in more detail. So what do we mean by image resolution? So we have 2 photos in front of us. I think they are recognizable. The resolution on the left, it's what we would call much higher resolution. You can really, pick out the features here. It's instantly recognizable. The one on the right, it's a much lower resolution scan. And, so some of those details are blurry. They're really hard to see. And so we measure the image resolution in PPI, pixels per inch. Now, how many people have heard of DPI? dots per inch. Dots per inch usually refers to the printed object. So you often will see DPI or dots per inch in relationship to a printer. Digital images are measured in PPI or pixels per inch. So the thing to remember is that the higher the PPI, the better the image quality. The image will appear sharper, as you can see on our photo on the left. But a higher PPI also means a larger file size. So if you're scanning a lot of photos at a high PPI, and I'll talk a little bit more about specific numbers, you're going to be using up more file space that way. So typically, when you're doing a scan of an image, you do not want to scan it at less than 300 PPI. Now, if you're scanning an object to retain what we call an archival copy, which is usually sort of the best copy, you'd want to use a setting up to like around 600 PPI for most items. So these are the this is sort of the thing that you can do when you're setting up your scanners. You can sort of make a decision about what resolution you want your photos to be scanned at or your images to be scanned at. Older fragile items or items with detail generally require a higher PPI setting. So scanning at 300 PPI for images you wish to print later at home is recommended. And that's because print resolution usually peaks at 300 PPI. And if you make it any higher, you really won't notice the difference for standard printers. If you are using a sort of professional or a commercial grade printer, the types of things that you might find at a print shop, then having an image with a higher resolution would be advantageous. We would recommend that if you are scanning items for long-term use, or you envision sort of needing a lot of flexibility in how you will be using them down the road, then I would always recommend scanning at a higher PPI, like 600.
Ryan, we did have a question.
Sure.
Is there a difference of DPI for documents as well as photos?
I really, my understanding of DPI is that it's more connected to the printing as opposed to pixels, which is sort of the display on a screen. So I think that probably, with DPI, if I'm interpreting this correctly, the higher the DPI, the better quality printout you will get. Just like the higher the PPI, the better resolution in the image you will have. So I hope that answers the question. But I know if you're asking if there is like a one-to-one type thing, I don't believe so. Are there any other questions? Okay, I will move on. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about file types and what types of decisions do you need to make when digitizing an item in terms of choosing a file type. And again, this is a decision that you can make prior to scanning, and you can, when you're setting your scanner up for digitization, you can tell it to scan at into a certain format so that the output is the file type you would want. And again, this comes back to thinking about how you will be using the digital object. And so there are a lot of different file types for digital objects. The slide in front of you, you can sort of see a bunch of different file types. Not all of them are for images. Some of them are for, you see a PDF, a doc file, an Excel file. But, you'll see a lot of these file types options when you're doing digitization, and you just need to be aware of what the differences are. We're going to be looking at two in particular in this presentation. But again, how we intend to use the digital objects determines the file type we choose. So let's look at the TIFF file and the JPEG file. So TIFF files are usually indicated by a .tif. Sometimes you'll see .tiff. The JPEG file is .jpg or JPEG. TIFF files, we think of those as the standard archival format for image files. And the reason is that they are considered lossless. And what I mean by that is they won't lose quality when saved or compressed. So you can continue to use that file, that TIFF file, share it, compress it, email it, or send it somewhere, and then someone opens it. You're not going to lose any quality. The thing to remember about TIFF files, I think I mentioned a moment ago, is that they are large files and they will take up a lot of space on your hard drive. TIFF files are ideal for retaining the highest quality copy of your image. They're good for reproducing, and they're good if you're going to be printing from them at a later date. JPEG files are smaller in file size, and they're considered lossy, meaning they can lose quality as they are saved and resaved over time. So if you think about sending a JPEG as an attachment in an email and sending it out to various people, they're going to open it and maybe send it and then share it with other people. Over time, you start to lose quality with JPEG files. Now, JPEGs, as I said, they are ideal for sharing via email or adding to a website. In fact, many web browsers can't display a TIFF file. So, if you are adding these images you're scanning to a website or sending them via email, I would always recommend saving JPEG. So the other thing I will say related to this is that you can always start with a TIFF file and then convert it to a sort of a reduced file or lesser quality file like a JPEG or some other format to share it with other people. But you can always work from that original archival format. And that's what we refer to as sort of archival copies and access copies. The access copies tend to be a lower quality, but they are easier to distribute and provide access to. Archival copies are usually considered the best version of that digital image. Okay, does anybody have any questions about either file type or resolution? Oh, PDF. So PDF is, used primarily for documents, though you can really, I think, sort of export really anything to PDF. It's a great format that, is widely used. It's really easy to open in just about, any browser on any computer. So that's why it's so popular. And there actually is a archival format for PDFs called PDF-A. I've not had an opportunity to work a whole lot with those, but I'll talk a little bit later about New York Heritage, but one of the things that when in New York Heritage is that we do make some of those access files in this digital repository available via PDF because the original files would be so large.
Mary Jean's asking, what was the PPI for archival TIFF files?
Oh, sure. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit, but I will answer your question. It is for an archival, depending on the material type, it'll vary. But if we're talking about images, we'd be looking at 600 PPI.
And then when you say TIFF files take a lot of space on your hard drive, do you have an estimate of how many pictures you might be able to save with 1 terabyte of space? That's from Tammy.
Well, I don't know that I could tell you with a terabyte of space, but I have a slide a little bit later that we'll look at that had, I think it was 400 images that were scanned as TIFF files, and it was about 30 gigabytes. So I wish I could tell you what the equivalent would be if it was a JPEG, but it's just something to consider that, that took up a whole lot of space on, particularly, I think we were initially tried to upload it into a cloud storage and it said, no, you're way past your limit. So you would be able to do quite a bit on a terabyte because as I said, we did about 420 TIFF files, maybe it was 450, and it ended up being about 20 some gigabytes. Okay, is there any other questions or? I think my next slide is going to answer some of that resolution questions you had regarding PPI and different types of items. So this slide here has what RRLC recommends to our members when doing digitization for different types of materials. So, you see we have photographs here, which I mentioned. We recommend scanning those at 600 PPI. Now, and we're saving them as an archival TIFF. Now, newspapers or books and other printed material, you can scan at 400 PPI, at a grayscale setting. And again, save those as a TIFF. We say other materials such as like oversized materials and maps, the recommendation is 600 PPI. We'll talk a little bit more why you would want to get a higher resolution for that. But given the size of the object, we all sort of recognize that 300 to 400 might be good enough too, just because those documents tend to be much larger than a photograph once they're scanned at that high resolution. So that kind of gives you a snapshot of some of the things. And again, this will be in the presentation that I'll be sending around. Or Nancy will be sending around.
Yeah. Kashal asks, do only certain scanners give you the opportunity to save a TIFF file?
I think probably, yeah, we have a couple scanners here that, and then, I know one of them does not. It's really just sort of designed to make quick scans of photographs. It's almost sort of just a little bit larger than a photograph. And then we have a larger Canon flatbed scanner. And that is something that we can do TIFFs from. So yeah, that's, when you're purchasing a scanner, you're going to kind of want to look at sort of what it can output. But yeah, not all scanners will have the option of doing TIFF files.
And then Nitra asks, when printing, I know that the relationship between size of original photo to the end size of the image when printed, how do you determine the PPI?
If you're looking at an image, how do you determine the PPI? Is that the question?
When printing, I know that the relationship, no.
Oh, okay.
Can you clarify the question maybe?
I've unmuted myself.
Okay.
Great.
So I've been, I just finished printing a book, and with a lot of photographs. And one of the things that I learned is if I take a tiny photograph, the original is tiny, and I want the printed image to be small as well, if I have the PPI too high, it confounds the end size, the printed size.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure that I could give you an answer to that question because I've not dealt with it from the perspective of printing.
Okay.
Typically, we're taking these in my role. I'm taking these digital files and we're uploading them to a website. So I'm not exactly sure what is going on there. If you are taking an existing photo and increasing is it already a digital photo? And then you're changing the PPI, is that correct?
Actually, I think the better question would be if you have the original photo, let's say, is an 8x10, but the image that you're going to print is only 2x3. If you scan the original at a high PPI, you can't shrink it down to the size that you want. Maybe it's because there's too many pixels. I don't know.
So can I say that if you're doing a self-published book, sometimes the medium that you use to publish with, they can be really tricky. Like Amazon self-publishing has some funky features about what they allow. So that could be one of the things. Sorry for jumping in, but I know
I appreciate it.
when you send it to a printer, often the printer can make sense of it. Here's this file, they shrink it, they do everything. When you're doing self-publishing, very often, like the Amazon self-publisher and things like that, they'll have just like a form that you send it through, or they say attach it here, and it's not intuitive. So that if that's the sort of book that you're thinking, the same thing with like photo books, sometimes they just get confused because they're not really designed for TIFF files usually. They're thinking most people are taking their snapshot and putting it up.
That was very helpful. Thank you, because I have no experience working with printers. So great. Well, thank you. Oh, I do see one more question here. Does the ability to scan, save, and TIFF depend on the program your scanner has loaded on it? Again, I think it really, probably the answer to that would be yes. The most scanners come with a software that you would install, and that will determine whether or not you have access to scan to a TIFF file. So as you're sort of doing your research or looking into buying a scanner, sort of just find out what formats that it will produce. As I said, some of them may just be limited to like JPEG or GIF files, but GIF. So I just, you kind of got to be aware that if you're looking for something that can do TIFF, they may not all do it. The thing about scanners is they can be a couple $100s, and they could be tens of thousands of dollars. So it really just sort of depends on what you're in the sort of what you're looking for. But certainly you could get something to do TIFF files sort of in that few $100 range. All right, let me move on. We're going to next talk about ownership and permission. So I guess in this instance, I'm going to be speaking to those folks that might be working with an organization or a group on a digitization project. If you're digitizing and sharing personal memories, then it's not likely that you need to seek out any sort of permission. But it's just good to be aware of some of the things that you might encounter. So the photo in this particular slide is from the SUNY Genesio's Milne Library. They have several really wonderful collections in New York Heritage, and actually many of the photos that I used in this presentation come from New York Heritage. This photo features Gothic revival style house from a collection of photographs that were commissioned by a grant from the Genesee Valley Council on the Arts to provide a record of notable architecture in Livingston County, New York. And the photo is credited to Daniel Fink. So because I've taken this photo from New York Heritage, I know that is something that the library has gotten permission to share. That's part of the process that we have for our members, is that they've established they have rights to digitize and share these items. But in the case of this photo, we have three stakeholders. So we have the Milne Library, the Genesee Valley Council of the Arts, and the photographer, Daniel Fink. So it's important that you're aware of all possible rights holders before going forward with a digitization project. And it just needs to be stressed that even if you own the object or a collection, it does not mean you have the right to digitize and redistribute it. And so let's just look at a specific scenario. The family of a prominent local photographer donated a sizable photographic collection to an organization approximately 20 years ago. So maybe it's your local library or historical society. The paperwork accompanying the gift does not indicate whether or not you have the right to redistribute. The library has possession of the photos, but is it clear that they can digitize and share them? So generally the answer is no. And if this is the case, you can do a couple things. So one main thing you can do is just reach out to the creator or surviving family members and request written permission to digitize and redistribute the photographs. If you're not able to obtain that permission after an exhaustive search, then your organization would have to assess risk about going forward with your project. The important thing, though, is that you are documenting your efforts to gain that permission, and that can actually help quite a bit. it will offer your organization some level of protection if you decide to move forward. Sort of falls in that, what is it? It's better to ask forgiveness than ask permission. I'm not sure that really holds a lot of water with organizations, but you can sort of think of it that way. So since we're going to be talking about ownership, I do just want to quickly touch on public domain items. So this might be something Larry recognizes, but so here's a stereograph card, and I would like just to ask the question, can it be digitized? And we're going to come to that answer in a moment. So when you're selecting items to digitize, it's important to know that the items can readily be included, and for what items you need to request permission. So the first question we need to ask is the work in the public domain? So Stanford University Library states that the term public domain refers to creative materials that are not protected by intellectual property laws, such as copyright, trademark, and patent laws. The public owns these works, not an individual or author or artist, and anyone can use a public domain work without obtaining permission, but no one can ever own it. So as of 2020, copyright has expired for all the works published in the United States before January 1st, 1925. If it was published on or after January 1st, 1925, it becomes more complicated. The answer to the above question for the stereograph image is yes. It comes from the Geneva Historical Society's collection of stereograph cards. It was created in the late 19th century, therefore it is in the public domain. So for the next couple slides, we're going to be talking about metadata. And so metadata, if you've ever worked around libraries, you probably are aware of what metadata is and how it is used. I'm going to try to give it like a sort of brief introduction to it and talk about some of the ways that you can use it when you're working with your digital objects. So very simply, metadata is a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. I was actually first introduced to the topic when I was getting my master's in library and information science, and my professor at the time just simply described it as information about information. And so examples of metadata for a digital object would include such things as the author or creator, the title of the object, its date of publication, its date of digitization, the file type, or descriptions of the objects in a folder. If you can think about a README file when you download some software, that README file is an example of metadata. So let's just take a closer look at this. So why is metadata important? In organizations such as RRLC and our members who are making digital collections available to the public, good metadata makes it more likely that users will find the digital items. Metadata provides a better experience for the end user. And again, it increases its findability. And the metadata that you might encounter just in your sort of daily lives is that, let's say you come across an old family photo and the information written on the back includes such things as the date, the names of the individuals in the photo, the place the photo was taken. That information is metadata. And it probably, when you find something like that, it makes your job a lot easier because you now sort of have this information that you may not have had before. Okay, so let's take a closer look at a photo to sort of understand a little bit more about what metadata is. I'd like you to add some observations to the chat window and just sort of tell me a couple things that you can sort of point out about this photo. Great, diner or kitchen. It's black and white, restaurant workers. Two people. Okay, perhaps 1950s. Maybe the 40s or 50s, 1940. 1950s attire. Oh, movie set, that's a good one. All right, well, let's see what we can find out. So metadata gives us descriptive information about the object. or a collection that might not be obvious just by looking at the item. And then you've shared a couple different observations here. So quality metadata or good metadata can sort of help answer questions like, who are the people in this photograph? When was the photograph taken? What are the dimensions of the original photograph? Where is that original kept? And what file format, which we've talked about, is that original photo in? So let's go to our next slide and see what kind of answers we can get here. This is a sample of some metadata or of the metadata for this particular photograph that has been created. I will say that this is something that you would see more at an institutional level and not something that you would necessarily take on for your own items. But again, you have a lot of flexibility there. So let's look at the answer to some of those questions on the last slide. So who are the people in this photograph? Well, we can look in the description field and we can see that it is a black and white photograph of George Davalos and the waitress Bessie Brady. And this photo is titled Hole in the Wall Restaurant Staff. So this, as someone suggested, restaurant staff. This is George and Bessie from the Hole in the Wall restaurant. When was the photo taken? So this might be surprising to someone, but it was determined that the photo was taken sometime between 1975 and 1980. And yes, they do look like happy employees. When I originally saw the photo, I was thinking along the lines of like 40s or 50s as well. But it was in fact 1975 and 1980. What were the dimensions of the original photograph? Well, if we look at the physical description field, we see that the photograph is black and white and it's 4 by 5 inches. And the original copy of this photo is kept at Perry Public Library. So as you can see, good metadata tells us quite a bit about an object that we can't see in the actual photograph. And it really does increase its findability once it's sort of put online. And so how much metadata you choose to record really is entirely up to you. It really should just serve your purposes or others that might be using the digital objects. But I will say that a good way to keep track of your digital objects metadata alongside keeping track and inventory of your file names is just to use a simple spreadsheet, whether it's Excel or I think Google Sheets, thank you, Google Sheets. There's a lot of spreadsheet tools that you can use to sort of create that inventory, and you can add fields for the important details that you want to keep track of, because let's face it, when you have a folder filled with photographs, it can become difficult to determine what is actually sort of in that digital file. So I mentioned something about spreadsheets and talking a little bit more about metadata, but going back to that example, how many times have you opened a folder and said, geez, what are all these files? Like, what am I looking at here? Adding some metadata about the contents of your folders can really be a big help. So I've given you 2 examples on this slide of some metadata that you can very quickly create to answer those questions. And I think in the long run, be a real time saver. So the top is a sort of snapshot of a spreadsheet. It tells me that this folder, it contains 2 distinct collections, both from the Perry Public Library. You can see the title. The first one is the Clark Rice Photography Collection. The second is the Henry Page Historical Files. And then there's a description of what's in the folder. That folder is made up of one folder that includes TIFF, TSV, text, and PNG files. We have the dates that sort of the images cover. And then we have the extent, and this goes back to that question about TIFF files and sizes. And I kind of was close. We have, in the first folder, we have 470 files that were scanned as TIFFs, and they're almost 30 gigabytes. So now we know a little bit more about what's in this folder. You can also add a bit of narrative text in your folder as well. And I mentioned earlier sort of the familiar README file that you would get when you're downloading software. And the second bit of information on the slide is just a brief description of the folder's contents. In this case, we created a simple text file using a text editor. You could use Microsoft Word or some other document as well. But we just save it as a text file and we create a narrative description of the folder's contents. So that way, if I go into a folder or one of my colleagues or anybody that might be looking, they can very quickly determine what is in this folder and is it any interest to go further. So that's just sort of a time-saving thing that you can do for yourself. So as you're collecting more and more photographs or images that you've scanned, you can really keep track of it and sort of organize it a little bit, a little bit more than just having everything in a single folder and not knowing what you're looking at. Does anybody have any questions about this? Yeah, oh, someone did say, note the second folder has more files but less gigabytes. Yeah, that is true. A lot of that may have to do with the size of the actual original images that were scanned. And so, depending on it, could have been some very small photographs, and the other ones could have been larger ones or some other types of documents. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up metadata just by saying a few words about creating file names. I'm a really big proponent about sort of doing some things in advance that will make things easier in the long run. And one of those things is creating good file names. So file names, it's recommended that they both be short and descriptive. You want to avoid any special characters or spaces when creating file names, and the exceptions would be using a dash or underscore. It's also recommended that you incorporate a date into your file name. And if you look down below, you can see that I've done that under one of the good file names. And the other thing is to be consistent. So if you were working on a collection of sort of similar materials, whether in terms of the subject matter, you might want to create a designation for those and then use that to start all of those photos. That way you know that they're connected in some way. So an example of a good file name, we take a look at our first one. We started with the date 2020 May 11th. That could be the date that the object was scanned originally. Then we have some indication of the subject, Smith Farm. So what we can assume is that maybe this is the Smith family farm or something like that. And then we have the file type TIFF. Another way you could do it, as I mentioned, you could sort of start all your files with a sort of common element. So in this case, we have a bunch of photos or images from the Johnson family. So we start our file name with Johnson family. We use an underscore to separate some of the other elements out. So we can assume maybe this is a photo of Frank Johnson with his horse. Bad types of file names, those names that are generated automatically by whether it's your camera or some other piece of hardware that are just a series of numbers, they don't really tell you a lot about the object. And if you opened a folder and just saw a bunch of files with a series of string of numbers, you're not really going to know anything about it. It may mean something to a machine, but it doesn't mean anything to you. Another example, which is a little bit better, and it's familyletter.pdf. So this does tell us that it's a family member, but one of the ways that you might be able to make this a little bit better was maybe what's the family name? What is the date of the letter? So including a date that the letter was written really could tell you a bit more about this letter, particularly if you're starting to collect these things. So the more, again, going back to the idea of something that is short and descriptive. And the final thing I'll say about this is that we do sort of, recommend that you limit special characters to underscores and dashes. And I will actually go a step further and say that I really would just recommend using dashes. And the reason for that is that if you are going to be taking this digital image and putting it online, maybe creating a link to it, when that link is published online, usually there's a line underneath it. And that line can obscure the underscores. And so when someone's looking at it, for example, this Johnson family Frank horse JPEG, they may not see those underscores and assume that there are spaces there.
So Shelley asked, why do you recommend avoiding spaces in file names?
I think you want to indicate that it's all one so that it doesn't really get sort of doesn't get broken up. A lot of times, I've noticed that when we've created some file names that when you put them online, it'll insert like dashes, but you want to sort of indicate that it is one string, sort of a string of text. And the dashes or underscores just tie everything together. Oh, okay. So, oh, that's some great information. Yeah, okay, so someone actually thinks that this, said that this is probably Nicholas Davalis and not George, from our earlier photo of the restaurant. Yeah.
It did say, I think it wrote that on the back of the photo that it was George Davalis and Bessie.
Yeah. Yeah, and Larry brings up a good point, is that a lot of times you will see if you have a space in your file name, some computer programs will fill that space with something like a, sometimes you'll see like a % sign, something like that, that really isn't attached to the original file name. So that's another reason why you would want to sort of make sure there's a connection the whole way through there. Thank you, Larry.
Okay, but this suggestion of of making these strings is only if you're intending to put it online, correct? If it's just for your own filing and access, that's not, you can do whatever you want, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you, yeah, I mean, there's no hard and fast sort of, like, that's not going to prevent you from accessing your files. If that's sort of, I think that's kind of what you're asking. Like, you can, I think ultimately when it comes to any of this is that you will want to determine what works best for you. So if you have a sort of naming convention that you're using that sort of helps you organize these things, then please continue to use that. But you're right that this using these underscores or text to sort of have a string really is beneficial in terms of making it available sort of to a wider audience online. And then I should also say that if you are working for an organization, and I've not encountered this too many in cultural heritage organizations, but some larger, technology companies or other larger organizations, they will have naming conventions that you need to follow. But you're right. If it's something that, if you have a system that works for you, by all means, please continue to use it, because ultimately you have to be able to retrieve the files in a way that's sort of best for you. Thank you for asking that. Okay, let's continue on. I'm going to move a little bit faster because we're kind of running to the end of our hour. Is that okay, Nancy?
Yep. Okay,
great. So let's take a look at some sample items and kind of review what we've learned in this presentation. We're back to a letter. Here's a letter from 1864, comes from New York Heritage. It's a letter from Leroy Pike to Anna Wilcox, dated February 1864. It's a Civil War letter. And so what we know about this letter right off the bat is, given its age, it is probably old. Well, we know that it's old, and we know that it is probably very sort of possibly brittle, it's yellowing, and it's ideal for digitization, given sort of those, given its age and the condition, and we would really want to limit any handling we have. So the ideal resolution for something like this would be 600 ppi so that we get the highest quality, because we do want to capture, that handwriting, which may be fading in some places. And a higher PPI will really bring that out. And then what file type you use just really depends on what you want to do with it. If it's something that you want to share with others, then you probably want to make sure you have a JPEG version of it. If you want to keep an archival copy, you would scan it at TIFF, as a TIFF, as I said, at 600 PPI. And the thing I just want to remind you that if you create high quality sort of archival versions of files, it's very easy to convert them to a lower sort of lower resolution, but sort of a lower sort of file type so that you can share it more easily. It's very difficult to take, it's not difficult, but it doesn't really work the same going backwards. So you don't really gain much taking a JPEG and saving it as a TIFF file. But you can always take a TIFF file and save it as a different format when you export it. This slide is, now I'm not going to assume that you have large maps that you need to scan, or if that's sort of part of the resources that you have, but you may have some larger objects. And so this slide, it's the plan of the state of New York from 1881. It's from the Illustrated Historical Atlas of the County of Chautauqua, New York. It's 14.5 inches by 17.5 inches. So right away we know that it's an oversized material. The recommendations for an oversized material are 600 PPI, and if possible, or you could probably get away with doing 300 to 400 PPI because of its size. Again, archival format for this would be TIFF. But let's just talk about some of the issues you might encounter scanning a map or an object this size. First, the size of the map. Many consumer scanners would not accommodate these dimensions. And second, consider the details in this map. It's really important that the person using it or accessing is able to identify the various features and landmarks represented. Can you capture them so that the digital object is useful? And third, this map is part of a larger work. The condition of the map and the accompanying volume might pose a challenge when digitizing. You always want to try to make sure, you avoid breaking up an object. And really that can become, it might be impossible of sort of what you want to do given the condition of the item. Sometimes, even when we send stuff off to vendors, that they can't always ensure that the item will not be damaged when they do the scanning. The good thing is that vendors tend to have a lot of different equipment that can accommodate various formats such as bound materials so that there is a minimal amount of wear and tear to the original.
And Don had a question. Is there a difference in scanning in black and white versus color?
Well, we do have, so yeah, it really depends on, it just depends on what the original object is. So if you were going to be scanning a manuscript, the other option would be grayscale. You would want to choose a grayscale option because that does give you the quality, like a higher quality. If it's like a black and white photograph even, you may not necessarily, well, I'll take that back. So you tend to always scan in color, I think, to get that archival quality. Some formats may ask you to scan in grayscale, such as newspapers or manuscripts, and I think that has to do with the if I remember correctly, the material that they're printed on. If you did a color scan of a newspaper, you probably would get sort of a lot of dark colors on there as opposed to sort of that grayscale. Okay, Larry mentions there's some good stitching software which would allow you to sort of pull various photos together. So if you don't have a large scale scanner, which, I mean, who does that isn't working in a print shop or a scanning, company that does scanning, you can sort of get some of these images together with some software. I unfortunately don't have any names of those offhand, but if anybody has any recommendations. When scanning letters and anything that might be fading, what about using the scanner software tools to enhance or otherwise improve quality? Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the things that I haven't mentioned here, but when we've done training in the past, is that there are ways that you could sort of use the software to bring out, maybe if we think about the letter from the previous slide, to sort of bring out that text a little bit more. So your scanner probably will come with some software that allows you to do some editing tool, sort of editing tools that allow you to sort of improve the quality of the software, of the object. Okay, and so want to just before, and we can ask more questions, certainly ask more questions later, but the last thing I kind of want to just wrap up with as it relates to this is that working with a vendor. if you are in a cultural heritage organization, you may have a large project, and working with a vendor may be ideal, particularly if you have a variety of formats. A vendor might be able to do that project much quicker, and they probably will have access to specialized scanners so that you are not damaging your items. So if you had a book or a diary, if you lay that on a flatbed scanner, you're going to start causing damage to the spine. They have cradle scanners at these places that can do a much better job at sort of capturing that image, correcting it once it's scanned, and then making sure that your original item is not damaged. I would always recommend, if you're going to be doing something like that, either with your individual stuff or if you're working with an organization, it's just, seek out recommendations. Talk to your network of, your sort of genealogy network where you have, or other people that have done it, and get those recommendations. But it may be a route to go if you have a lot of items. The other thing I will mention is this actually came up in an earlier presentation that I did for some of our members, and that is the use of services such as Legacy Box or the Kodak Digitization Box. And I've not used these services either professionally or personally, but what they are is they are a mail-in service that really focuses on the consumer. They offer to digitize things like home movies and photographs, you sort of pretty standard personal memories. They have packages that range from $60 all the way up to $1,100, but there are limits to their service, such as they have a very narrow category of materials that they will accept. If you have large scale items, they will not digitize those. They also don't appear to scan to archival formats from what I can tell. I think typically they'll scan to PDF and JPEG. So I would be reluctant to recommend the service to any of our members for any digitization projects they were working on, but it might be something to consider for your own items. And if anybody has any experience with them, I would love to hear that. Oh, someone used Legacy to scan 10 old VHS movies and the quality was okay. Okay, well, that's good to know. Yeah, I mean, it definitely is an option because, I think Nancy can attest to the fact that getting I think you were in the market for a new VHS to DVD scanner, is that correct?
Right, because we bought one from Amazon for the library for patrons to use, and it lasted 3 months. And I thought it was a new piece of equipment. It turns out it was refurbished.
Yeah.
And, they didn't want to hear anything about it.
Yeah.
Trying to on it. So, yeah.
And that equipment is not, it's expensive. It's so that's a big deal that when you run into something like that. The one thing I will just add is this made me think is that, I know Irondequoit Public Library, as part of their, you have like a maker's lab, and that includes some digitization equipment. And that's a trend I'm seeing in public libraries, is creating, these stations that allow their users to come in and make digital copies of these things, and it's kind of reducing the barrier, particularly the hardware barrier that a lot of us might have, just our inability to either afford or have access to these materials. So I think this is a great trend in libraries. It really brings in, it brings people in, it gives them, they teach them how to use the equipment. And I just think it's a wonderful direction for public libraries. The last thing that I want to do before we finish up is that, as I mentioned, I work for the Rochester Regional Library Council, and we're part of the Empire State Library Network, and we have 3 services that I do just want to spend a moment talking about: New York Heritage Digital Collections, New York State Historic Newspapers, and the Empire Archival Discovery Cooperative. For those of you not familiar with the services, New York Heritage is a research portal focusing on the people, places, and institutions in New York State. The collections in New York Heritage represent a broad range of historical, scholarly, and cultural materials held in libraries, museums, and archives throughout the state. Collection items include photographs, letters, diaries, directories, maps, books, and more. And the great thing is that it is free to you. New York State Historic Newspapers, I would imagine a lot of you are familiar with this. It's very popular among genealogists, and it provides free online access to a wide range of New York newspapers across the history of New York. There are currently 10 million searchable pages available, and the earliest date back to 1725. In fact, we're going to be adding some new papers to our region coming up very shortly. If Bill's still in this meeting, I'll be in touch via email shortly. Empire ADC, the Archival Discovery Cooperative, and this is a source of information about archival collections held in cultural heritage organizations across New York State. At Empire ADC, you can search and browse collection descriptions called, what we tend to think of as finding aids, and they will help you discover what historical materials are available for your research and where to find them. So I'm going to drop those links into the chat for you.
And thank you for saying that, Ryan. I just found out tonight, thanks to Larry, that you all can save the chat, which might be helpful after this is over. We're also recording this, and when I do send out my follow-up email, I will have a link to our YouTube channel, which will have this presentation on there, so you can watch and listen to it again. But yeah, on the chat, if you're seeing like the two, everyone to the right of that, at least on my screen, it shows a little paper with the edge folded over and file. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, you click on that and it saves it. Larry, maybe you can answer that, or Ryan. I haven't done it, so.
Yeah, it'll say, it should save to your documents I think it'll save to your documents folder.
Yeah, it saves it as a text file. You click
Yeah.
on the three little dots.
Yeah. And I think it automatically will end up in your text file, and there may be a Zoom folder once you do that in your documents folder, and you will just want to look in there. I found that in the past that it's not necessarily the most intuitive. It doesn't sort of save it in the most intuitive place, or you can't designate it to save to your desktop. But hopefully maybe that's changed, but that was my last experience. So that's all that I have for you tonight. I hope that you got a lot of good information out of this. I know that when I go into my first digitization project, and every time I do one, there's a really new set of challenges, but things, sort of some of the stumbling blocks that you'll encounter on your first go around really teach you a lot. So I hope that this was kind of food for thought moving forward, and some can really help inform your decisions down the road. And again, my recommendation is take advantage of your network. If you have specific questions, reach out to the people doing the same work. They probably have some experiences. And I've found that most people who are really passionate about something are always willing to share. So thank you. If anybody does have any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate the presentation. You gave us a lot of good information about saving those memories. And just as a reminder, the follow-up email will come, I'm going to say next week, but it is Thanksgiving week too. So hopefully early next week. If not, don't be concerned if it's the week after that. But I do send the follow-up with his presentation, with the link for the actual recording. And I think that's it. I'm not seeing any other questions. I hope I'm not missing any. Did you see anybody?
I've not seen anything.
Okay, okay, you can also highlight and copy and paste the chat into a Word doc. Okay, that's cool. Somebody did a screenshot of this chat, so good ideas.
Yeah.
So if nobody else has any other questions, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate that you're participating in our Zoom genealogy group meetings. And thank you again, Ryan. Thanks for all the wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And everybody have a wonderful night. Stay healthy.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good one. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye, Nancy. Bye, Larry.
Bye, Ryan. Bye, Larry. Thanks, everybody.